what other people tend to forget. And the history of Islam in this country, in terms of the development of a strong community versus individual Muslims, is a very, very powerful history. And it's riddled with similarities and a general direction where Islam in this country takes on a particular representation, it takes on a particular presentation, a certain feel, because for several decades in this country, what it meant to be a Muslim was that it meant to be an individual that was part of a larger community that was bent on producing an alternative society in the United States. So an alternative society that desired to solve social problems, economic problems, and therefore to alter the political landscape of this country as well, just to provide an alternative. The Muslims, the term Muslim, meant somebody who stood for justice, lived a different lifestyle, and followed a certain set of values and principles that meant standing up for the quote-unquote little guy, looking after the community, but it also meant challenging authority in a constructive way. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk about tonight. And the history of Islam in this country at a communal level really begins with the last year of Malcolm X, a shaheed, the first American shaheed, and it arguably ends with the death of Muhammad Ali, the champ. And so in between that time, that's about 40-something years, so it's almost half a decade. In that period, Islam has grown, developed, but it's altered, it's gone into a different direction than its initial trajectory. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. And thank you.
It's directional, so if you get a little closer.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And naturally, we're not going to sit here and go over a 40-year history in deep detail, but what we hope to do is draw out a few points that are very important for us to remember, to have conversations about, to share with our children, and to hopefully inspire all of us to think deeper and to delve deeper into the history of Islam in this country. So there's a lot of literature, first of all, about how there were Muslims here when there were African slaves that were here, and in the Civil War, in the time of the Revolutionary War, that's true, there were Muslims that were here. In the Civil War period, yes, there were Muslims that were here. There were enslaved Muslims and children of enslaved Muslims, etc. Yes, that's very true. In the 1900s, you had the start of sort of proto-Islamic movements that were connected with sort of black nationalist movements and things of that nature. So you had the term Islam was there. The American society knew the term Mohammedan, so nobody used the word Muslim in, for example, the 1800s. That word didn't exist. It was Mohammedan. So the word Muslim enters into American language and American discourse in the 1920s and after that, so after World War I. And it's introduced in the black community, right? It's introduced through the, Marcus Garvey and some other folks as well, Noble Drew Ali, and they use sort of Islam for other agendas to really alter and change the identity of African Americans. So this is sort of the early beginnings. This is not, contrary to popular opinion, this is not where American Islam or Islam in America actually begins. Not. This is where we have Muslims that are present, yes. You have individuals that use the term Islam for a particular ideology, but it is not, orthodox Islam. It is not true Islam. It is Hislam, right, or other Islam. So they pick and choose. So you really get the roots and the foundations of a Muslim community in the United States, particularly an American Muslim community in the United States. It begins in the 60s, in the early 60s. It begins, for our purposes tonight, I'm going to date it in 1964. It actually begins in 1962. But for our purposes tonight, 1964. So here's the timeline. You ready? Here's the timeline. So March, we're in the month of March now, 2019. So let's go back. March 12th, 1964, Malcolm X gives a press conference and he announces that he's breaking with the Nation of Islam. And he also announces he's leaving the Nation of Islam and he's going to form a separate mosque and a separate organization. 4 days later, on the 16th, he establishes an organization, the Masjid, which is called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. A few days after that, 2 days after that, on March 18th, 1964, he goes to Harvard University. And Malcolm, when he goes to Harvard University, he gives a speech. And we actually have the record of his speech. It's still there at Harvard in the archives. And at this speech, he outlines a vision for Islam in the United States. Did you know this? Did you know this? Right? It's unbelievable. Right? It's really unbelievable. And I'm going to highlight some things from that speech in a minute. So he says basically, rahimahullah, may Allah ta'ala have rahmah on him. He says basically, if Islam is going to grow in this country, well, this is what it needs to look like. And he outlines it. And he does that at Harvard. Right? So, and then it's packaged, it's documented, and it's archived. So he gives that speech, he outlines it, and then he forms an organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the purpose of that organization, which is separate from the mosque. So he believed the masjid was for spiritual development. He believed a separate institution needed to be devoted to the enhancement of the identity and the humanization of African Americans in the community, and then by extension, everyone else. So he was actually going against the direction of the civil rights movement. He said civil rights is not good enough. We need human rights. Right? That was Malcolm's agenda, rahimahullah. And so he established this organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, to achieve that result and set about its goals and its vision. So he meets Dr. King a few weeks later. On April 13th in 64, he goes to Hajj. He writes a journal, talks about his experience. In May, he's invited to Al-Azhar University. Sheikh Al-Azhar in Cairo welcomes Malcolm. He gives him a full ijazah. Right? You know what ijazah is, right? A full ijazah going back to the Prophet ﷺ. Sheikh Al-Azhar does. Did you know that? Right? So he's the first American to have ijazah from Sheikh Al-Azhar. And Sheikh Al-Azhar credentialed him with a certificate. And his certificate his ijazah was in two areas. One in da'wah, right? One da'wah. So he certified him to teach Islam and to convey Islam globally, but specifically in the United States, right? So this Sheikh Al-Azhar certifying him as a da'i with the isnad. This is amazing. Second, he credentialed him as a teacher of general Islam. This is after his Hajj. He goes to Ghana, receives the Quran. He visits he visits many different sites in the Islamic world, in the Muslim world. Later on in the year, in September, he was back. He performs an Umrah. Actually, he performs Umrah twice as well. He returns to the U.S., goes to Paris, London. He does a lot of trips. And then we know in February 1965, he's assassinated, and his life is taken. His sister, we know his wife, Betty, Sister Betty, rahimahullah, a week after Malcolm dies, she performs Hajj. She's actually pregnant, so she performs Hajj when she's 7 months pregnant. And she learns deeper about her Islam, and she becomes a leader, an example for Muslim women in the Muslim women in the Muslim community as well. And then his sister, Ella Collins, rahimahullah, also took up the mantle to lead his organization, and they both passed in the 90s, etc. So when he died, rahimahullah, he left behind a vision about Islam in this country. And from 1965 until around 1990, right, until around the early 90s, that vision was more or less being implemented. So one of the things that he said is that Islam in this country is based, or should be based, off of institutions and people that are sincere, that are devoted to prayer. So the salat would be central to the representation of the Muslim community. Education, he talked about, and how if Islam is going to grow and develop in this country, it's going to be because Muslims develop new methods of teaching and new styles of teaching, and schools that teach alternative ways of thinking and not just produce parrots in society, right? People, children, and individuals that just parrot the same thing over and over and over again. That education had to be revolutionized, and education was revolutionized and should be revolutionized by the Muslims. So the Muslims had to be the ones to invent and innovate new methodologies for teaching, right? He talked about the idea of balance. He said there must be some people in the world that introduce balance between a spiritual life and a material life. And those people that have to introduce that balance are American Muslims. So he said American Muslims must be the ones to teach people, because we have access to so much wealth, so many resources in this country that other Muslims and other people don't have access to. So we must be the ones to steward these resources wisely. And the only way that we become wise stewards of the wealth and the resources here is through our understanding of our deen and the spiritual, what he said, the spiritual foundations of our deen, right? So Malcolm, rahimahullah, what he said was, it is part and parcel of our project that we develop, that we understand that Islam, and this is a quote from his speech, quote, that Islam is the fountain from which spiritual growth is derived, end quote, right? Islam is the fountain from which spiritual growth is derived. And he said, Muslims, American Muslims, he said, must believe that. And then what he meant by that, he would further elaborate, this is in a speech at Harvard, he would further elaborate and talk about ideologies. He said, American Muslims must be the ones not to be victims of ideology, because that's a form of enslavement of the mind. And he, in other speeches, he wrote about how he was a victim of being mentally enslaved, right, through the teachings of Elijah Muhammad that he had to break away from. Right? He talked about that, and he wrote about that, and he spoke about that publicly. This is in the record. So he said that the only way to liberate the mind is through educational reform, is through understanding the spiritual teachings of the Islamic tradition. And then later on, what he said was the importance of language study. So he said American Muslims must be the ones to learn different languages. If you reduce yourself to only speaking English, then you become a slave of the ideas that are imported through that language, that are produced in that language. So he said American Muslims must speak Arabic. That's the language of the Quran, that is a liberating language. And he also said American Muslims must learn how to think in Arabic. That's what he said. In other words, you've got to learn how to think differently. Now, I can tell you as somebody who, alhamdulillah, has studied in Arab countries, and someone who studied in Istanbul, Turkey, and having studied Turkish, which is a beautiful language, very difficult actually. You have to have sabr to learn Turkish. But when you do, oh, an ocean of material opens up for you. It's an ocean of material. So when you learn a language, you think differently. You understand differently. And then you are able to critique differently and think about thought. This is what Malcolm was saying. So this was what his vision was for American Muslims. This is what he was talking about. So he said, and this was all related to balancing spiritual and material life. Now, he laid out some other things that we don't have time to go into. Maybe one day we can come back and we can go over this in detail. This is the topic of my research. It's been years, alhamdulillah. And so now I'm trying to speak about these things because I believe that there is deep value in this. And I believe that in our history, there are wonderful gems to be harvested that will give us new direction and vision in this country. So just to pollinate a little bit and fast forward. So Malcolm introduces, rahimahullah, this vision, and it's taken up by certain figures. Certain figures in Islam take this and run with it. And when they do it in different areas of the community of the United States, and they do it in different ways. And those figures, those what I call and what others have called founding figures of communal American Islam, these founding figures became gateways and doors for mass conversions, right? Mass conversions of people to Islam from the 60s, from the mid-60s to the 90s. So some of the names of these people, these individuals, so the first one, for example, we could go chronologically, but just to give you an idea, some of the names, so Imam Warthi Muhammad, Imam W.D. Muhammad, rahimahullah, and the world community, that became one door and one gateway. Another one was Imam Yusuf Muzaffar ad-Din Hamid of the Islamic Party. So this was another door and another gateway. Even before, 2 years before Malcolm, rahimahullah, was Imam Yahya Abdul Karim and the Dar al-Islam movement. That became another door and another gateway, and actually through that, Imam Jamil Al-Amin came through that and became a very charismatic leader, particularly in the South. That was another door. We must include the work of Sister Betty Shabazz and her influence on many, many Muslim women as well. And we can also perhaps include to a lesser extent, but to a lesser extent in terms of community work, but to a larger extent regarding sort of national inspiration, of course, Muhammad Ali, rahimahullah, the champ. So these individuals were the major forerunners of the growth and development of Islam in this country. And it wasn't that they started, it wasn't necessarily, institutions and buildings, but it was the work that was done. It was the work that was done that made a large difference. So for example, just to highlight certain things, the work of Imam Warith Din Muhammad, rahimahullah, who was actually the son of Elijah Muhammad, but when his father died in 1975, he was the one that converted the overwhelming majority of Muslims, almost 100,000, from the Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam. And through his work and his leadership, many temples were converted to mosques, and the entire Muslim community that was a part of that organization became driven towards interfaith. In the 70s, in the 80s, nobody did interfaith in the United States of America, right? Muslims didn't do interfaith except the W.D. Muhammad community, right? I mean, that's who did interfaith. They launched interfaith work. They did women's empowerment as well. They produced women leaders. They trained women. Alhamdulillah, before he died, I had the pleasure of having a one-on-one conversation with Imam W.D. Muhammad in Istanbul, Turkey, actually. And it was his dream, his vision was that new relationships would be built and collaborated and cultivated with American Muslims and Turkey as well, because he saw that what was going on in Turkey and the directions that Turkey was headed in was going to be very beneficial in terms of being inspirations for the American Muslim community. I mean, certainly this institution here is a tremendous gift to the American Muslims, and this is a gift that we should be humbled and proud of as well, and we should support this gift, because Allah Ta'ala will ask us on the Day of Judgment if we neglected it to support it and all the other gifts that He gave us. So this is one of the benefits of one of the unique aspects of the Imam W.D. Muhammad community. If we want to say a little bit about Imam Jamil rahimahullah, I was personally raised in the community of Imam Jamil. He was Imam of my masjid when I was a child, and I knew him personally from when I was a child, and I still communicate with him today in his, even in the incarcerated setting. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala liberate him from that. His health is at times stable, at times unstable, and alhamdulillah, it seems there are new doors that are opening up in that regard. But Imam Jamil, his contribution to American Islam is the idea of his taking Malcolm's notion of revolution of ourselves and our minds, and what he called revolution by the book. That we have an internal individual revolution to do, that we can't go and try to change society without first trying to change ourselves. We have to first make a revolution in our own selves. We have to deal with our own problems, our own shortcomings. We have to enhance ourselves, and then as a byproduct of that, we enhance the community around us. So he taught about that, and he talked about the importance of using the Quran, using the Islamic teachings, using the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the spiritual teachings of Islam to cultivate a sense of self, a better sense of identity, a better sense of your Muslim identity and your worth, to enhance your well-being, and then as a result of that, enhancing the world around you. And there were 30, 40 communities in the south of the United States that followed him in that, and are still practicing those teachings, and they did a lot of work in the community. Islamic Party, as I mentioned before, started here in DC. How many of you are familiar with the work of the Islamic Party? So just a few hands go up. The Islamic Party was here in DC, and Imam Yusuf Muzaffar-ad-Din Hamid, who died in the 90s, was a tremendous pioneer to the work of economic and political and social justice. And so he saw that what was going on, that Islam in DC was not working at all, that the institution that was here at the time was an institution that was devoted towards just a show, and it was not dedicated to working in the community. So he said, Islam is about work, and people need to be put to work in their communities. So he started his da'wah at Howard University, and many different Muslims, many different people converted at Howard, and he started a large movement, and he called it the Islamic Party. And the idea was to galvanize people to change the neighborhood makeup in DC. So he had, taking principles from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, he said, look, we're going to work on 3 different issues. We're going to solve the problem of hunger in DC. 1, so anybody that's hungry in DC, if they're elderly, if they're homeless, when they hear the name Muslim, they're going to associate it with being fed, right? And so he and the Islamic Party, they had projects where they would go out, especially during the month of Ramadan, and they would just feed people. And they would find out who was elderly, and they would drop food off. They produced newsletters, and they did analysis on the political ideologies of the time. Whatever was going on in the public sphere, they wrote about it from an Islamic point of view. They educated the public, and so many people became Muslim in and around DC. And then the movement spread on different parts of the East Coast, even down to Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. And so I have relatives that came into Islam from the Islamic Party. And the Islamic Party was actually influenced, interestingly enough, by so many teachers overseas, because Yusuf Muzaffar-ad-Din had gone overseas and learned Islam in many different countries. He benefited from the teachings in Turkey, he benefited from the teachings in Pakistan, he benefited from the teachings in different parts of the Muslim world, in Egypt as well. So, so many Muslims came into Islam through the grassroots community efforts of the Islamic Party. And so, of these different doors, you had, hundreds, dozens of thousands of community members, or well over hundreds of thousands of Muslims. Most of them were African American at the time, but some were Latino Muslims as well, who came into Islam because these different doors, these different founding figures started to do the work that was envisioned and spoken about by Malcolm. Now, the person that we're going to end on, Muhammad Ali, rahimahullah, also went through that trajectory, but his trajectory is a little bit different. He never obviously served as imam of a community or anything of that nature, but his function was different. So his function was obviously being someone who was in the spotlight, obviously someone who had a national reputation. The eyes were on him as a symbol of how you could be an American hero and still retain a very strong Islamic identity, right? And the idea of Islam going from the grassroots, spreading like wildfire all across the nation, from different gateways, and then rising up to the highest aspects of American society, shocked various aspects of the American society. One caveat I want to mention in this history, which is really fascinating, as a side note, is the arts. The arts were used also in the spread of Islam in this country in the 80s, in what we call the R&B era, or the Reagan-Bush era. So during that time, really quickly, Islam became, because it was in the community, it was in the urban areas, people were experiencing difficulty because of crime, because of police brutality, etc. And the arts emerged as another vehicle and another voice in terms of the spread of Islam in this country. And there's one particular genre that is credited as being a genre that incorporated Islam and Islamic teachings through the work of Malcolm, through the inspiration of Malcolm. So just like we mentioned Imam W.D. Muhammad, just like we mentioned the work of Betty Shabazz, rahimahullah, and Yusuf Muzaffar-ad-Din and Imam Jamil, for example, Ella Collins, for example, just like those individuals were gateways for mass conversion to Islam, mass recognition of Islam, a particular artistic genre occurred in the 80s and then the 90s. And that was hip hop. So hip hop as a genre was wed to Islamic themes and Islamic concepts because of the primary fact, the primary reason that in the urban areas in the Bronx, in New York City, where it was born, there was the words of Malcolm resonated in New York City, particularly in the urban poor areas. And one of the concepts that got taught to people in poor neighborhoods from the Muslims was the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which was used over and over again by many Muslim leaders to inspire other people to do the work in the community. As a hadith I spoke about today in the khutbah that said, basically in English, if you want to find me, the Prophet ﷺ said, seek me amongst the poor. Find me amongst the downtrodden. Abghuni bidu'afaikum, find me amongst the weak, right? And so that artistic genre, hip hop, started off amongst the poor and amongst the weak, right? People on the street, in the corner, downtrodden youth who wanted to express their frustration. And so the concept of giving voice to the poor, giving voice to those that were downtrodden, giving them the ability to do like Malcolm, use words to speak truth to power, use words and your intellect to respond, not violence. That became a part of hip hop music, and you had many Muslims, many artists that were Muslim, and many non-Muslim artists that knew and learned about Islam from being around Muslims and incorporated certain things. So Brooklyn, in hip hop culture, Brooklyn was called Mecca, and Harlem was called Mecca, and Brooklyn was called Medina, actually, right? Harlem was called Mecca, and this was widely known for folks in these areas. So even if you weren't Muslim, and so you had then, urban African American youth who weren't even Muslim, but who would carry Muslim cultures, right? So people walking around with taqiyas and tasbih around their wrists, and you had parents giving their children Muslim names, though they weren't Muslim. So you had Khadija and Latifa and Akbar and Khalil and all these, but they weren't Muslim. But the culture of Islam was something people could be proud about because they understood what it meant and what was behind it. And to conclude, so this movement occurred, and the idea was that Islam was an alternative to the status quo. And it was a way of living so that you didn't forget about who you lived with. You didn't leave people behind. You cared about your community. You wanted to respond to conditions that were oppressive, whether those conditions were intellectual, whether those conditions were economic. And you cared about what was going on. That was American Islam, and that was the growth and the path it went on until 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, there was a drastic change. There was a different attention, there was a different approach. When Ali dies, when Muhammad Ali dies, what happens is that alternative, what seemed to die with him was that history and the practice of it, right? That legacy. Because now we have a very different trajectory in terms of American Islam. So he was the last, if you will, figure, particularly in the public sphere, where people knew about Islam and had also a respect of who he was, both as an American and as a Muslim. And that symbolism of being an American and a Muslim and somebody where non-Muslim could say, that's something amazing there. That happened with Islam pre-9/11. After 9/11, because of so many other issues, the media portrayal of things, violence against Muslims, etc., right-wing extremists, Islamophobia, all of these things tended to take the community in a different direction. So I want to stop there. There's so many other things that we cannot talk about because of the nature of time, but in general, these are the touch points that animate our history here in this country. Of course, in the 90s, you had rises of other institutions, of course, CARE and things of that nature. But these are the things I wanted to highlight now. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala. Thank you.
Inshallah, we'd like to take a few questions from the audience. If you can raise your hand, I can bring the microphone.
In the back, I believe. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah.
I have a quick question about the Islamic Party, where you mentioned that the party was focused on solving specific issues. I caught the part about hunger, but I don't know what you said after that.
You caught the part about what? I'm sorry?
About hunger. I don't know what other issues you mentioned after that.
Economic injustice as well. Islamic Party was very concerned about economic injustice. So what the Islamic Party, one of the things they did was encourage entrepreneurships, right? So, my father passed, rahimahullah, but my stepfather, he was the treasurer for the Islamic Party. And so one of the things he was in charge of, was collecting the revenue from the businesses that were established to support the cause of Islam. So the idea was that you never, that each and every member of the Islamic Party, or each and every person that came in to work, had to get involved with some kind of communal activity that was either oriented towards social justice or economic justice. And so they had various kinds of businesses. They owned, taxi companies. They owned food stores. They owned different companies because Malcolm's, Imam Yusuf Muzaffaruddin was inspired by Malcolm's words about economic independence. So what I did not mention was that when Malcolm laid out the vision for American Islam, one of the things he laid out was economic freedom from economic slavery. That was another thing Malcolm did, rahimahullah, and out of respect, I should say Imam Malcolm, rahimahullah, because he is our leader and the first Imam in this country of Islam. So what he did was, he said, in order for American Muslims to really be a recognized force in this country, American Muslims must be economically free. Because as long as we are economically dependent, we are always going to be slaves of somebody else's agenda or pawns of somebody else's agenda. So essentially, success, if we are slaves, if we are economically dependent, then even in our success is not real. Because at any moment, we can be pulled back, or any moment we can be put in check. Because as long as we work for somebody else's agenda, then it inhibits the freedom that is required to really act as a Muslim who is concerned about change in this country, right? So the Islamic Party took that as a mandate as well. Not to say, Imam W.D. Muhammad did as well. The work of the world community of Islam is really unparalleled in terms of economic transformation and economic opportunities. So that was also there. Imam Jamil as well, in his context. I personally spent many days in the store of Imam Jamil. He believed that Muslims must have a skill. You have to have some skill. And this, of course, is from the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, who thought that everybody should have some kind of skill whatsoever. And he sought refuge from poverty. Not that poverty is bad, because he said, seek me amongst the poor. But the bad part about poverty is that it puts a person in a position of relying on other people. That's the part.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
My name is Brother Muhammad Yusuf, and I'm one of the founding members of the Islamic Party of North America.
Allahu Akbar.
And one thing I would like to
Brother, you should be up here, please. Please, you should stand. Because we salute your work. Allahu Akbar. May Allah bless you for your leadership, your service, and your service to Islam in this country.
Well, one thing I want to emphasize is that in the Islamic Party, we work very close with Jamaat Islamic under the leadership of Maulana Maududi.
Yes.
Now, I was assigned to Maulana Maududi when he was in America.
When he was ill, yes.
Right. And we put a lot of emphasis on being Islamic workers.
That's right.
We didn't put emphasis on just talking, but, are you ready to go to work? Are you ready to be part of Jamaat living community? And I'd like to add one thing. I don't want to offend anyone, but we never emphasized that we were Sunni Muslim. We said we were Muslims.
That's right.
Now, members of the Dar Islam movement, they did emphasize that they were Sunni Muslims.
Right.
Now, also at that time, we were closely connected to positive brothers of the Ikhwan, and we would study from Sayyid Qutb and Imam Hassan al-Banna.
That's right.
So I just want to emphasize that we were Muslims, and we were willing to work with any Muslim who's oppressed to alleviate the oppression in their life, whether it was from the tyranny of the Shah of Iran. We weren't getting caught up in a Sunni Shia issue, but we were dealing with a human issue. I just want to emphasize Islam, Muslim, with no adjective trying to describe the type of Muslim we were. Now, I'd like to add one other thing. during the time that, and I will use this term, under Honorable Elijah Muhammad, when he passed, Imam Wafdi Muhammad was making his transition to the Universal Brotherhood of Islam,
Right.
and he was in meetings with members of Jamaat Islami out of Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And this would have been like Anis Ahmed, Kershaw Ahmed, people who were in leadership at that time. And they came to the Islamic Party, and they told the Islamic Party members to be very, very patient with Imam Wafdi Muhammad, that there were changes coming about. And this is before a lot of the rank and file of the world community of Al-Islam at the time knew that this was taking place. So all this was being planned in a righteous way to where it is today.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just going to say salam alaikum. I hope everybody,
Inshallah.
like Brother Malcolm said, this concentrating on trying to be a good, decent human being, know that we all come from the same one God,
That's right.
and that we're not here to overthrow anything, but we are here to enjoy what is right and forbid what is wrong.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Wa alaikum salam. Wa alaikum salam. There's a question here from
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
My name is Muhammad al-Hashimi. I was also a member of the Islamic Party
Inshallah.
in the day. Before that, I was a field lieutenant in the Black Panther Party in Detroit, Michigan.
Inshallah.
And of course, we had a real big problem with COINTELPRO
Yeah.
in those days.
Yeah.
This was the time when the American government would groom agents
Yep.
and infiltrate the party. And in those days, they were very brazen. You know, we had some agents from the American government come to our meetings in Detroit. And one of my close friends at that time was Charles Diggs Jr.,